The following is in conversation with Gerard Vroomen. Gerard's story is pretty amazing. It was really amazing to talk with Gerard and to hear his journey from student to building one of the most important bicycle brands in the world in Cervelo. In the conversation, you really get to kind of hear his boots on the ground telling of how they were able to get some traction in high performance triathlon bikes, and how through innovation and through just a lot of tenacity and a lot of work that they were able to make inroads in the incredibly difficult North American market. Gerard is an entrepreneur and an engineer. When I asked Gerard what was the distribution of the two, his answer was yes. This is the Business of Cycling podcast. Gerard Vroomen, thank you so much for coming on today. Good morning. You mentioned there may be some hammering happening, so we'll see how that goes. Maybe we can cut it out if there is a occasional hammer here and there. So
it's not me putting a bike together, it's people working on the house, so it's not the kind of violence we usually bring upon our bikes.
So to get started, you are on your website, gerard.cc, which I love. I love the domain. You are an engineer and an entrepreneur. Is that a fair, were you more engineer or more entrepreneur?
Yes.
Both, a 50-50.
I mean, I couldn't be one without the other, I think. So
Depends
I
on
always, when I was in engineering school, we'd always visit these companies that employed lots of engineers, and I would look around and go like, oh, I hope I don't end up here. So then the only way to avoid that was really start my own company. And, I think without the engineering background, and of course also Phil's engineering background at Cervelo, that company wouldn't have been the success that it became. So yeah, there is not one without the other.
So engineers, you think that the engineers live sort of a solitary technical, like where they're just doing like calculations and doing really boring stuff all day long? Is that what you're saying?
No, not at all. I mean, that's what I thought, or that's how it felt when I was 20, 21, right? And we went into these engineering heavy companies that were all very serious, and yeah, and the topics, just the companies we visited, but the topics didn't really interest me. And I thought, okay, I really wanted to do something that interests me, right? And yeah, that passion was bikes. So to combine that with the engineering was, of course, the dream come true, right? I mean, and other people are interested in other things and are happy being engineers on other products, right? If you
Sure.
really love cars and you can get a job at BMW, then you're happy as a clam, right? But for me, it was a little bit differently. And if you're an engineer, you want to be an engineer in a bike company. I mean, back in those days, bike companies didn't really employ very many engineers, right? That wasn't really a viable career path.
And so you've always sort of had an affinity for, I don't know, economics, business, building things, I suppose, maybe?
No, not really. I mean, I never thought I'd be an entrepreneur like when I was growing up or anything like that. It seemed to be what was necessary to do what I wanted to do. So, and just at engineering school, my final year project was the design of a bike. And I was just there for a couple of months, and then I was told there was no budget left to do anything basically, so I couldn't make a prototype. So I decided to build my own prototype with my own money together with Phil. And so we sunk the little money we had as engineers into building this prototype, and then we thought, how do we get this money back? And then the conclusion was we have a couple more and sell them to people. So that's how we rolled into it. But really the idea was to build a couple, sell them, and then find a real job, as we called it. But to build a couple, we had to sink even more money in and more money. So this break-even point where we could, say goodbye to this bike stuff and find another job, sort of, kept running away from us. And then, at some point it turned out that it was a real company, and and then we continued. But it wasn't really ever a specific point for me where I thought like, okay, now I'm going to be an entrepreneur.
So this was in at university when you did this initial project. Can you tell us a little bit more about that project and kind of what was the life of it?
Yeah, so it was design of an aerodynamic bicycle, and I mean, I went to university in the Netherlands, but I managed to finagle my way into doing my final year project at McGill in Montreal. And so, yeah, the design of aerodynamic bicycles. So I did some aerodynamic testing and then structural analysis of the bike to see if we could make this aerodynamic shape in a way that would hold a rider. And so when that was done on the theoretical side, I really wanted to also build this prototype for my project. And so that's what Phil and I did. And the summer vacation, we were working in the basement of the house I was staying at, and doing wet layup of carbon fiber over a foam core and turning that into what some fans of Cervelo might know as the Cervelo Baraki, so the green monster. And that was at that time it was blue and it didn't have Cervelo on it because the word Cervelo didn't exist yet. But that's what became the nucleus of Cervelo.
What did you guys, so you mentioned you had this project, you had an idea and a design. And did you know that, I mean, did you guys have an idea like, wait a second, like this is something that, is different and so you began to like shop it? Was that sort of the thinking?
No, I had made contact before I started the project with Johnny Buño, who was,
Sure.
double world champion a couple of years before. And so I was building this bike for him. And it wasn't really at that point still with the idea of you know, turning it into anything, turning it into a company or making multiples. And at that time, if you recall, there were a lot of one-off bikes that, were made for pros to be something special, like the Pinarello Espada that was made for Indoor. And so there was lots of crazy stuff going on without necessarily the intention of making any more of them or selling them to anybody. So that's how that project also started. It was just to make Johnny Buño faster, and that was sort of it. And of course, we
Why
never
Johnny
made him
Buño?
faster because his
Why Johnny Buño? Because he was the world champion. You said, I'm just going to go to the world champion.
yeah, well, he wasn't world champion in time trialing. Far from it. He was really lousy. So then I thought, you can really improve him. But I was always a fan of his. So as a cycling fan, I was a fan of Johnny Buño, and so that was the reason. I was also a fan of Fausto Coppi, but he was dead for 30 years already, so hard to go
Okay.
to him. So I figured I needed somebody who was good and alive, and so we went with Johnny Buño. And
You
he
just called him up
responded.
one day.
That also helps.
Right, because today it's like you go on LinkedIn, you reach out, or I guess if it's an athlete, you have to call their agent. Like, how did you contact him?
Yeah, I've told this story, I think, a couple of times, but I just wrote a letter to him and in French, because I mean, I don't speak Italian, but I knew he spoke some French. And I mailed that to Gianni Bugno, Italy. And then I figured, gets to Italy. And then there's some people at the post office who knows roughly where Gianni Bugno lives. And then it gets eventually to a mailman who knows exactly where Gianni Bugno lives. And it said, if you're interested, send us a fax, very modern, at this number. And then a week later, I received a fax from Gianni Bugno. So it turns out that, somebody did know where he lived. And from the fax, we did a phone call, and he put us in touch with the team to get some time trial wheels and things like that for our testing and to build up the first bike. And so it rolls from there. And everything went great. We showed the team the bike, and then, of course, the team just had this little detail to do, which is, telling their bike sponsor.
Yeah,
The bike sponsor completely logically said, absolutely not. And that was sort of where that project ended.
right. So from there, it feels like you guys had some momentum then at that point with some credibility where this team was saying, hey, look, this is faster. We like this. So where did you guys go from there?
Well, I didn't really have any credibility, like the outside world, right? Nobody ever knew about all this because the team just said no in the end, and it was not something we could publish or do anything with really. So yeah, we just went on our way to figure out how to make a couple more of them and make our money back, and then we quickly realized it's impossible to make this thing in any, economically sensible way. So then we decided to make a completely different design, which became the Cervelo P2. and to, try and make our money back that way. But of course, that meant, more expenses to actually get that developed. So, the cost just kept climbing quicker than the money came in. So just making our money back, yeah, it took a long time to actually achieve that break-even point.
So you were, I guess, yeah, if you're going to help me understand, so you had this design, you had a concept, you probably had at some point some pre-orders. Would there have been like, where was the money coming from? Really? Like, was it
Well,
investors
they
or was
came
it?
from what little money we had as engineers or as engineering students, I should say at that time.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, this bike that we built for Bunyo, it was, a one-piece monocoque carbon, non-adjustable saddle heights, non-adjustable aero bars. So just completely impractical to make for other people. And then, you can't make it in volume. They need to make a mold for every customer. So
Sure.
that, it's pretty price inhibitive. So then we decided to make, some alloy frames out of, just tubular aluminum, weld it. And so, yeah, we developed that, made a prototype, then built the first 25 and sold that and reinvested that. But yeah, just there were a lot of expenses associated with it as well. So it's not like we were immediately, wildly profitable and seeing our bank account go from red back to black. It stayed red pretty long. So
Sure. And that was just, and where was the initial kind of commercial push, I guess? Was it Canada?
yeah, first store was Canada, and I mean Phil was really the one who quickly identified like, hey, time trialing is nice, but we should be in triathlon, same bike, but just for, it's a bigger market, especially in North America, of course.
Sure.
And these are people looking for new technology. They're fairly affluent, and there were triathlon bikes, but there weren't really a lot of, let's say, premium but still affordable aero bikes out there. The aero bikes that were out there for triathletes were like Hada, Lotus, like really the sort of super bikes of
Sure.
that time, right? Like what we would now call UCI illegal, but at that time still legal. And then, but there wasn't really, and then at the bottom end you had, mostly round tube like Quintana Roo and other, even still steel frames were there, or people using just a road bike with clip-on aero bars. So there was sort of a gap in there, we thought, for a high performance but still, affordable aero bike. And that's what we aimed to P2 at. And so our first customers were triathletes, and the first stores were triathlon stores. And so at that time there weren't that many triathlon stores, really stores focusing on it. There were, people maybe sold every now and then a triathlon bike, but the real triathlon stores were in North America, maybe, a dozen.
Sure.
So you quickly know what your target
Yeah,
is, and all you have to
positioning.
do is
Yeah,
try and get in there, right?
totally.
So, and those, of course, were stores with pretty strong connection to the existing triathlon brands as well. So that wasn't as easy, but and we did a lot of cold calling also to, these other thousands of bike dealers, but that really usually didn't lead to anything. It was just really an exercise in frustration.
Sure.
I don't think we ever successfully called anybody, and it's a pretty soul crushing exercise
It
if you're
can
not the
be.
salesperson. So.
It can be.
Uh,
Well, I think it's funny.
almost it was for me, that's for sure. And I think it was for Phil as well. I remember he had, you just had these calls that lasted 5 seconds, right? Because people just weren't interested. And one time he had a call and it was like 25 minutes, and the guy was super interested. And at the end, okay, so can I send you more information about Cervelo? And the guy said, Cervelo, I thought you were from Serrata. No, sorry, no interest. So that was the most successful cold call ever. Where and people sometimes thought that, Phil White, that it was actually Phil Wood who would make these, the hubs and other machine stuff.
Sure.
So they'd be interested before realizing it was Phil White and not Phil Wood. So those were, those sides of failures were really our success stories. That's how bad it was. But then these dozen triathlon stores, they're usually interested and just took time to get, space in their stores because, they already had other brands. And but yeah, the sort of first store was a store in Toronto, and then, just the usual suspects in the States that were, the bigger stores we would get into eventually, like Mission Bay in Chicago, and Inside Out Sports in the Carolinas, and Nitro, which was a real mainstay in California, and so stores like that.
And so it was a question of positioning, it sounds like. It sounds like you guys needed to find some positioning where there was space at a price point that where there was a need. And this is something that I think it's a rule that applies everywhere. That to get any sort of business off the ground, you do have to get some traction, because it sounds like with cold calling, like even with cold calling, I was going to add was that you do have to have something that generates some interest. I mean, cold calling with no positioning, no like reasons why, no reputation is incredibly soul crushing and difficult.
Yeah,
So
I think our big advantage was in focusing on triathlon. Like, it did two things. First of all, it was a small market, which meant that magazines were small and things like that. So it meant you could actually afford advertising, right? It was very
totally.
hard to pay for an ad that was at least so big that you could find it in something like Velo News, because we're just a big road riding magazine. But
Sure.
they had a triathlon magazine, Inside Triathlon, same publisher, and you just get a full page ad for next to nothing, because so yes, very few people would see that ad, but the people who saw it were
Targeted,
almost automatically interested in your product, right? So it was
very
very
targeted.
targeted and affordable. And the other thing is, like, you can't really be most people cannot really be a triathlete without doing triathlons, right? Otherwise, you're just somebody who swims, bikes, and runs. So all these people were really into these competitions. So we would go almost every weekend to these races. And so we would have direct one-on-one contact with our potential customers. We could show them the product, we could do test rides, and an event, I mean, it cost you $100 or $200 for a booth, right? It was nothing. It was more to travel to get there. Or you would do it together with a store, right? So it'd say, okay, you're ready, have a booth there. I just fly in and I man the booth for you with my own products. So, and this is really how, in the end, we got into most of the stores, was because we got into these connections with the consumer, and the consumer then wanted the product, and the consumer then eventually convinced the store, to pick up the brand, rather than the other way around of reaching the customer through the store.
So you guys
And of course,
had an innovative aero cost-effective product for triathlon that you were able to get some momentum, get some traction. But now you're saying that how did you guys then, because the next category was road cycling, correct?
yep.
Okay, and how did you
Yeah,
guys,
that was very difficult.
I'm sorry?
You really get, of course, I say that was very difficult. You really get pigeonholed, of course, into, we weren't busy creating a brand or anything like that. We're just building bikes and trying to sell them, right? But by going into triathlon, of course, you quickly become known as a triathlon brand. And then, you need to work really, really hard to dig yourself out of that, and also become, because I mean, road riders weren't terribly fond of triathletes,
It's the athlete
uh,
triathletes want to be
or the other way around. I think both way around there was not necessarily any love lost
okay.
between those two groups. So to be, if you get too strongly associated with triathlon, then it's very hard to go back the other way, right? And so there were other triathlon brands that had tried and failed to do that, and it was incredibly hard. So we would, where we could, we would always try to keep the parity between the two sides, and try to create more visibility for road, even when 99% of our sales were triathlon, right? So if you look at our, say, the first 10 years of our catalog, road would always be in the front,
Sure.
and we would always have, hey, we have two triathlon models, then we need to have two road models. Like, we just need to come up with something. It doesn't matter if we sell a single one, but we need to have this parity, and we need to. But even then, it was hard. I mean, it took forever, even when we started, sponsoring Team CSC and be on the Pro Tour and win, all these big races, and eventually win the Tour de France. Like, even in 2011, so 3 years after winning the Tour de France, our sales were roughly 50-50.
Wow.
And of course, on one hand, that's because our triathlon sales were insane, right? Like, they do this bike count at the World Championships, and Cervelo would have 5 times more than the second brand. So, I mean, one reason it was only 50-50 is because the triathlon sales were very high. But also, of course, in road, I mean, there's so many competitors, so many different reasons
It's a
why you
hornet's
would buy
nest.
brand A or brand B. So yeah, it was very hard to really get that same level of and then go beyond that level of sales that we had in triathlon.
So it sounds to me like you did this triathlon positioning, which is an interesting, like it's something you see in business everywhere. It's like you have a product, but you have to first kind of find this minimum, I guess it's minimum addressable market, minimum, the amount that can sustain whatever
But
costs that you
viable,
have.
yeah. Minimum
Yeah,
viable addressable market.
exactly. And so you guys were able to do that by providing value to that market. And then it sounds like with your triathlon cash flow that was generated, you were plowing it directly into what would eventually be the road cycling market. You were saying, look, there's only so much that we can sell here, and we have aspirations. It sounds like we have like aspirations for road cycling. So to do that, we need to begin investing in road cycling, even though it doesn't justify the investment initially. And you invested in World Tour teams, which what does a World Tour team cost to sponsor?
Well, then I just want to correct, like we didn't necessarily position ourselves in triathlon. We stumbled into triathlon, then we found ourselves there, and then we figured, okay, eventually maybe we need a bigger market than just this. But for sure, I mean, when we sponsored Team CSC, the biggest cost was the bikes. I mean, we're just a small company, and they wanted 150 or 200 bikes. Like that was the biggest cost. The cash component was very small. I think in general, the cash component was small in those days because we also talked to, one other team. But and then in this, for that team, it was, particularly small. And I mean, part of that was, I think, because they really wanted to do something else. Part of it was because the team wasn't very good when we started. Like we really just, hitched our wagon on that ride at the right time in that sense. Like I remember they were 14th in the world ranking when we sponsored them. And now we always think about this kind of powerhouse, but they were just, I mean, they had on the whole sponsor, the whole sides of the shorts was Selle Italia, just a saddle maker, right? So it's not like they had big corporate sponsors at that time, like CSC, of course, this was a big sponsor, but for a small amount. And then they had like the Tiscali, which was, soon to be defunct. So, and yeah, we just figured it was just one of those investments, just like you say, we were making money on the triathlon side and we were using it to build up our road side. And so that money went to, yeah, a small sponsorship fee and then, all those bikes,
Which was
which
probably
was
your entire marketing budget at that point, I'm assuming.
no, I mean, we always realized, I mean, you see this a lot back in the day and a little bit still now is that people go, oh, I signed the sponsorship contract, I'm done. But we
I'm good.
realized, that's just where it begins, right? So Phil had read somewhere that for every dollar that Nike puts into sponsoring somebody, they set aside $7 to promote that sponsorship. Now that ratio we couldn't achieve because
Wow,
that would have been more
that's
than our entire.
crazy. That's crazy.
But it did give us the strong belief that hey, we need to have money to promote this sponsorship. We cannot just leave it on people will see it and that will be it. So
An active sports
and
marketing.
the nice thing was that Bjarne Rees, of course, who and Alex Peterson was the general manager of the team at the time. Like they really wanted to do everything differently. And so it wasn't just us coming on board as complete newbies in this space. Like at the same year, Zip became the wheel sponsor. They'd never done anything in pro cycling. Speedplay became the pedal sponsor. Easton became the cockpit sponsor. And they were even further behind than us. They didn't even have the product. So I called them in December, like, when are you going to ship the product? And they go, like, we don't make drop bars yet. But they'd signed the sponsorship agreement. So it was, who else was there? SRAM, they were sponsoring with cassette, the cassette and chain. That's all they had. And so, yeah, we were just this motley crew of completely clueless people into this world. But everybody was like, hey, this is the biggest deal we've got going for ourselves, just way beyond anything else we're doing so far. So everybody's interested in pooling their advertising dollars to make them go further. So we were actually with those, 4 or 5 brands, we were able to buy full page ads in Velo News and some other, big road magazines. and still have the cost be relatively, limited for each of the participants. And so, yeah, we didn't spend 7 times what we spend on those bikes and the sponsorship fee, but we did spend a reasonable amount
So I
on
guess
promoting it.
so I guess you're able to then, it sounds like the sports marketing was the key that sort of promoted, at least for enthusiasts, because Cervelo is a high-end at the time was, it still is a high-end road product, I guess we could say. And
Mhm.
so the competitive component, the professional, the results component is a huge factor when trying to achieve success. But I think there was like a macroeconomic, there were some macroeconomic things happening in a sense that you guys were seen as the carbon fiber authority in a sense as well.
That came really later because when we sponsored, we didn't even have a carbon frame. So we sponsored them with an alloy soloist, so a aero road frame. And then of course the P3 alloy time trial frame, triathlon / time trial frame. And then we even had a steel frame for Paris-Roubaix. It wasn't carbon yet, but yeah, I think there were a couple of things. Definitely there was a lot of free publicity simply because the story was so crazy. I mean, we were so small. So, just the surprise of us sponsoring a Pro Tour team was so big that we got a lot of attention from that. And of course, with products and everything, we were really trying to push that, and we were also really trying to do things differently to make our dollar go a little bit further, right? So we were doing these things that now, sound really archaic, but then nobody was doing. Like we did daily blogs from the Tour de France when, nobody was really doing these things. We're starting to do videos from the Tour de France, and both from just behind the scenes things from the Tour de France in general and with the team. And so we're also trying to do these things that were maybe, didn't cost us a lot and could be picked up by other media or could be easily be shared by our customers long before, viral was a word. And it wasn't really a huge strategy necessarily behind it. It was just always like, hey, let's just do what other people are not doing. Then at the very least, people are going to talk about it, right? And yet it may work out, it may not work out, but they'll talk about it. And so we were also, in North America, the Tour de France, there were really only 2 or 3 advertisers for the Tour de France normally. It was always Bowflex and Subway sandwiches and, maybe 1 or 2 other ones. But there was never anything industry specific. And so Cervelo was the first one to do TV ads during the Tour de France, which was, I remember
Wow.
it was pretty cheap. And we spent $200,000 to advertise throughout the whole Tour de France on, I don't even know what the network was. It was OLN in Canada. I don't know what it was in the States. But, some 2-bit network, which nobody watches except people who are really into cycling,
Enthusiasts,
right?
right?
So again, sort of a similar, at a bigger scale, obviously, but similar to the triathlon story where, okay, it's a very small target, but it's very targeted. And so, we'd make these really cheap ads and then run that and then, learned a lot from that, such as when you get 150 ads during the Tour de France, people get really sick and tired of your ad after they've seen it the 10th time. So then, the next year we learned, hey, we're going to make 15 ads. We're just going to keep shooting them, and then at least we can switch them up a bit. And so all these things that, like, yes, it was good to be seen, but also people were like, wow, I cannot believe I just saw a Subway ad and a Cervelo ad and then a Bowflex ad. Like, how big must Cervelo be that they do this? And people start to get interested in this brand, go, they're not big at all. Like, but why, why Cervelo? Why is not Trek doing
Right, or
TV commercials,
specialist,
right?
right?
So just these ideas that just, hey, we just wanted people to take notice and just be surprised. And then, sometimes those things didn't work out at all, and sometimes they work out really well, but at least people are talking about you.
And you were profitable at that time. I mean, because it sounds like you're dumping a lot of money into this investment for the team, investment for the Tour de France for this type of advertising. Like how were you
Yeah,
guys
we
able
were
to
actually,
stay cash flow positive? Because it sounds like a
yeah,
pretty
yeah.
big
Well,
whipsaw
there's
here.
profit, there's profitable and there's cash flow positive. So we were profitable pretty quickly. Like we were profitable from year 2. We were not cash flow positive because we were growing really fast, and
Everything was
we were
going into
always.
production. Yeah.
I remember after 3 years having our administration in shoe boxes, we decided to take it to a accountant, try and get
Sure.
financials. And we're like, we don't understand it. Like we just do the math. We make the bike for this much, we sell it for this much, we do this margin, we number times the number of bikes we sell, like, and we spend almost nothing. We paid ourselves $50 a week. And like we spent money on nothing other than a little bit of the advertising. Like we must be making money. How does this work? And then the accountant after a week goes like, well, it's pretty simple. The money is in inventory. And
It's
of course,
inside
that's
the
how it
bikes.
goes when you grow,
Yeah.
right? Like it's just your inventory grows as well to be able to do that. So yeah, we were cash flow negative and yet profitable. And that's actually is how it's been. It's we started with some money from family and friends because it was very hard to get money from the bank. Not much has changed since, I think. And especially that time, if you were not a .com, then you could forget about finding money. But eventually we got local Canadian banks to support us. And I have to say it got easier when we were in the Tour de France. Now all of a sudden, because we were the only Canadian story in the Tour de France, right? There was not even a rider in that first year that we were in the Tour in 2003. So we got all the Canadian media to visit us, like all the TV stations, all the radio stations. And so now all of a sudden, also normal people started to hear about this brand. And when we were looking for new banking, or all of a sudden we had a much better intro and people had heard of us, and I thought it was cool to support a brand like us. So then we got a lot easier time to find financing from the banks.
So, okay. And you guys were able to keep, you and Phil were 50-50 in terms of
Yeah.
ownership, and you didn't take
Yeah,
on.
never actually. Like we had a couple, we didn't have actually 50-50 shares, but we'd always said because it was complicated, and I was an immigrant to Canada, and then everything was a bit of a mess. But we'd always said like, hey, there's some group of activities here, and we own it 50-50, even if the shares say something else. So.
Just want to take a minute and let you guys know, in addition to the work that I do on the Business of Cycling podcast, I also provide go-to-market strategy and support for cycling brands. So what I do is I help with e-commerce sales, strategy and support, online ads like Google and Meta, B2C and B2B campaign strategies, as well as SEO. I've been helping brands for over 10 years, brands like Chinelli, Santini, Elite, Northwave, Elastic Interface, just to name a few. So if you're interested in getting in touch with me, you can write me at wyatt@velomedia.io. Now let's get back to the show. Okay. And so through all this, you didn't even need to bring in financing, like outside financing other than the banks.
Correct. We had the banks, and then we had, they just had, we had normal line of credit, and then in the peak season, January to April, they gave us some extra. And so, but yeah, we always were able to pay everything out of our profits and the bank financing.
But you weren't making very much money I imagine, in terms of like liquid
No,
cash.
I mean, it was,
for you guys.
we weren't generating a lot of cash, no, but
Yeah.
the profitability was good, but
Yeah.
I mean, when you double your
It's all in
sales
the-
every year
it's
and
all in the
you also
warehouse.
double your inventory every
Yeah,
year, it's
a
all
little-
working capital that it goes into.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have
Nice problem to have, they say. Yeah.
yeah, I guess. I mean, you do at some point want to have, some results, I suppose. But so at what
Yeah,
point?
well, we were just young, and so the $50 a week, it was okay, right? We didn't have time to spend it on anything anyways. We were working all the time, so we just need to buy food.
Sure. And so you're living in Canada and you're building it up. And so I'm assuming that at some point you also began working with, it sounds like the distribution was mostly North America to start. And then did you then move to a European distribution later?
Yeah, so we had some early distributors, but really also that was very much a consumer pool rather than our push. So, and of course that got easier once you get into the Tour de France and everything like that. But also through the triathlon side already, like, when people, we're mostly focused on North America, but then if you go to, Ironman Hawaii World Championships, well, then there's also Germans and French and Brits and everything there. So we already did have, some notoriety in these countries as we then went to find a distributor there. So yeah, we never really did the cold calling equivalent of the distribution outside of North America. There was always already a nucleus of recognition there.
Sure. So the U.S. distribution sort of created the demand. The U.S. kind of the growth in the U.S. created then demand in Europe through that sort of
Yeah,
a
so people who travel or do races, or and then eventually to seeing it in the the tour and these other events. And so of course we just go to Eurobike, and and then you get people who approach you because they've been asked by customers. And then in North America we always were direct to the dealer. And then at the start in Europe we definitely did that through this, which also helps your cash flow a bit, right? Now it's the distributor holding that inventory instead of you
sure,
having to hold it yourself. So you're not making a ton of money on these on those sales, because that distributor also wants an extra margin. But
sure.
but they're sort of, it's free revenue because the distributor is buying it and you're not really buying it yourself and holding it.
Right. And in the US, that the bike distributor model isn't quite as common. Is that why that you started that way, or it just kind of happened that way?
No, they were there. I mean, certainly, all the European brands had a distributor in the States, right? But I mean, if you can do it yourself and somehow find the money, then, not giving 30% margin to your distributor, and
Better.
that's a big difference, right? So,
Totally.
but we considered it at that time, and we had talks with some distributors that, when you go back and forth, like you have a distributor maybe already has an established network of dealers, then, they okay, if your margin is lower, but they can actually sell more because they're, on day one in 100 dealers instead of still scraping by with 10 shops. It could make sense to use that distributor, right? It's
For scale, yeah.
they also do something for their fee. So only some of them do. So yeah, if you find a good distributor, it can definitely help despite the extra cost.
Sure. And so then it looks like at a certain point, you guys decided to let the brand go, I guess, in a sense that you guys had sold the brand in 2012. Was this something that was
Mhm.
always in the cards? Did you feel like you were done with that project? You wanted to try something new? I mean, what was the logic behind that?
No, I mean, we were growing, every year and doubling most years, since we started in 95, right? The only exception being 2003, the first year of CSC, we didn't grow at all because we had so many problems with the team and with production and everything. And so we also established eventually an office in Europe so that we could sell direct to stores instead of, through these distributors in
Right.
certain countries anyways. And I mean, we thought doubling sales was normal. We'd never worked in a company that didn't double sales because all we knew was really
Sure,
what
from
we'd done
college.
ourselves, right?
You went from
And
college
and
to
so exactly. So we just, our planning was always based on that, and maybe we'd miss the target and only grow 80%, and we'd be annoyed, and but we were just completely clueless, and so when the times were good, of course everything is good, and then when the sales started to slow down a little bit, obviously 2008 there was a financial crisis, and that was just the year that we also launched the Cervelo test team, going away from CSC and doing it ourselves. And so the cost, kept increasing, and we thought it doesn't matter, we just double sales and we can easily cover that, right? And so when that didn't quite happen, then it got a lot more stressful. And also just at that point, me being in Europe and Phil being in Canada, communication wasn't that great anymore. And it's not like we had a fallout, but we realized that, hey, we need to streamline this company again. It's gotten a little bit too unwieldy. So we decided to close the European office and focus everything again in Canada, just to get, not only to cut those costs, but also just to become more efficient and just get a better control again over the company. Because it's just difficult to work together with the 6 hour time difference between Europe and Toronto. And so we also then thought, like, you know what, we should have one CEO, not two. And so I stepped out of the operational side of things in 2011. And so I was still a shareholder, but I didn't have any active role anymore. And then, yeah, we were sort of thinking, okay, is this really working out? Like, for me, it was kind of strange. Like, now my pension is sitting there in this company that I have no influence on. And I think Phil was also, we were pretty tired. We'd been doing this for
Yeah.
15 years and we'd
Yeah.
never
15
really
years.
taken a break.
Sure.
And, it's you just get tired after a while, right?
Well,
And then,
it's like
as long as things are going really well, then your adrenaline will pull you through. But then if you're tired and things are not going so well, then go like, hey, maybe we should sell the company. And so that's, towards the end of 2011, go like, hey, either we need to have more cash in the company because, you need a lot of cash to grow, but then when the growth slows down, then you also have a cash issue, right? So I thought,
sure.
oh, we need more cash in the company, and then it just makes total sense to sell the whole company. And yeah, so there were a bunch of companies interested, and then end of 2011, we sort of provisionally sold the company to Pon. In 2012, that was sort of, finalized.
So there's a few different things here that I want to dive into. It's like this wasn't, at least the way that you're talking about it, this, because I've worked with a lot of European entrepreneurs, and their business is like their child, right? It's like their baby. And I've seen situations where, the entrepreneur has a hard time leaving, the entrepreneur has a hard time passing along the control to the next generation. But it sounds like you didn't have quite such a strong connection with this brand from the way you're talking. Am I reading that correctly?
No, I don't think you're reading that correctly. I think I still do. I mean, I love that brand, right? It doesn't happen very often that you can just, start a company, come up with a name, and then, at some point, this name means,
More.
like, I mean, it's a made up name, and at some point, this name really means something to a lot of people, right? I don't just mean emotionally, but it's like, it's a thing now, right? It's like, oh, it's a Cervelo. I own a Cervelo. I ride a Cervelo. Jumbo Visma is sponsored by Cervelo, right? All of a sudden, these 7 letters that are just pretty random when you start, all of a sudden it's really something. And to build that, and with the group of people that we built that with, like we had an incredible engineering team. We had unbelievable people in sales and customer service and marketing, and just people who were maybe, didn't have the usual credentials for those jobs, but just, really, really loved that company and would do anything for that company. Nobody ever complained if we had to work late or whatever it was, right? Everybody just wanted to get the job done. And, that was, yeah, that was just fantastic. So, but I think the last years were just really, really tough. Also, we had some legal issues with other bike companies and other things. And it just, some of the things that are really draining your energy, they just start to become bigger than the ones that give you energy. And also, I mean, I'm not a huge people person. And once we had, between the company and the team, we had 150 people. It was just too big. It just didn't, it is not that I didn't like the people or that I didn't like the brand, but it just gotten too big. So then, I mean, what do? You love the company, but it's gotten too big. Do you force the company to get smaller again? I mean, that's kind of hard to do, right? So I mean, you could, of course, but then you have to fire people that you love. That doesn't really work either. So it was just incompatible. So it didn't really have to do anything with how much I did or didn't love that company or that brand. It was just my personality was just incompatible with the size and the complexity of what that company had become. Because we never thought about this. It's like I always say, it's kind of like the pumpkin contest, right? Where you try to grow as big a pumpkin as possible. And that's sort of how we thought, like that's what a company is. It's something you try to grow as big as possible. I never gave any thought to like what's the correct size of the company or it's like, the only purpose seemed to be, yeah, it's like I had a 6-year-old vision of a company. It's something you're supposed to grow. So that's what we did. And then it was so big that I thought like, I don't like this. You can't put it back. Can't put it back in the jar, right?
No, I get it.
Um,
And there's also
so yeah. So then what do? The only thing you can do is leave, right? So, but it's not a reflection of how much I did or didn't like that company or that brand.
No, I get it. I get it. That makes a lot of sense because there's loving a company and then there's being compatible with, having a compatible position with the nature of your skills and your personality that to still be compatible with the company and want
Yeah, and
to
we had tried the last years before, we had tried to find a good, COO to take on more daily work. Because I mean, there's certainly that. I mean, there's when we were tired because we worked, very hard at this, and also we were in some areas bumping up to the limits of our skills, or
skills.
we'd gone
Sure.
already way beyond it. So we realized we needed somebody with, you know, different skill set to come in and do, a big part of the work. And, but it's very hard. And partially it's probably hard because you're still this owner operator and you have your own ideas. I also think we picked the wrong person. So yeah, if you don't quite have the right person and you're probably a quite annoying owner operator
Operator.
that's still walking around the business, then it's going to be very hard to make that a success, right? And so I think it was sort of in the end the perfect storm, right? Where we knew we needed at least one of those kind of people, and that didn't work out. Then financially, it got tougher because of the financial crisis, and we would always have this bump in January where people on Wall Street get their bonus, right? No, we didn't get a bump in 2009 or 2010 or
I
2011,
didn't,
right?
I haven't heard this
Um,
before.
yeah, honestly, we could see that definitely, and because normally January is not a big month, right, for bike sales, so you really know
Nope.
something's going on. And then when it disappears, bump that again. So, so it was sort of becoming this perfect storm. Like we'd started the team, which was of course costing us a lot more money than being just a sponsor. And the idea for the team was always we would run the team, but we would have somebody else being the title sponsor. But title sponsors were hard to find in those years of the financial crisis as well. So it was sort of a perfect storm. And then the personal, tiredness and the legal battles and things like that. So yeah, that was really the reason I stepped out. And then, Phil just said, "Okay, I still feel I can keep going," but I think in the end he was pretty tired too. And I just felt that things were getting worse, not better. So then we decided that it's better to sell it to somebody who's really financially strong and has has a whole structure and can just weather these storms and come out the other end.
No, it is a cash flow intensive business. Absolutely.
It can be.
I had a conversation with Gary Fisher, and it was similar in that sense, where he stayed on operationally with Trek for years, and he was kind of strategically involved with the sourcing and everything like that in Taiwan. But it was a similar situation where he was just like, this thing gets so big where you're just like, you got the tiger by the tail, and you want the thing to continue to grow and you want it to continue to flourish, but there's only so much you can do at a certain point. So makes perfect
Well, I
sense.
mean, we were a $50 million company doing ordering and the inventory management on a spreadsheet, right? So it was quite intense.
So you stepped away, and this was 2012. And so at that point, I don't know what was going on in your mind before we go and jump into the next chapter. I guess what were your plans at that time once you were done? Like what was your goal once you had sort of stepped away and had left the company?
Well, so I stepped away in May of 2011, like operationally, and then I thought I just need to rest first. And then the next day I thought I have no income. So I booked a flight, and the next day I was off to China to talk to some suppliers and just start to think about what kind of project I could do now. And of course, couldn't be road bikes or triathlon bikes or something like that. So I, jumped into the just ideas about mountain bikes and other things. And but yeah, so my taking a rest lasted one day, and then I panicked, and then
Lasted one day.
immediately started something else. Yeah, yes, it's
Okay.
it's, it's really true. Yeah, May 11th. I still remember. It was my day off.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
And so what
So,
did
which was really not good for this whole, fatigue, burnout kind of feeling.
right.
But yeah, So that's what happened. And I started working on some ideas. And then a couple months later, I talked to Andy Kessler, who was our international sales manager at Cervelo, sorry. And before that, he was the CEO of BMC. And so talked to him and said, I'm going to do this. And then he said, okay, let's do it together. And that became Open Cycle.
Okay. And what was Open Cycle like? What exactly does Open Cycle do? I guess just to give people an idea.
Well, my goal for Open Cycle was to avoid everything I didn't like about Cervelo. So do almost always the opposite. And it's not that it's anti-Cervelo, because that would mean I have something against Cervelo, but it was against everything that I guess Cervelo did to me as as an organization, or I say, like, everything I didn't like about my job at Cervelo. And so we decided to keep it very small, to grow it to a certain size that we liked and could manage and thought was the right size. So it was more about growing to the right size rather than maximizing everything. And so our slogan pretty early on was working hard to stay small, and it's really how we see it still today. And so every step of the way, so that we can grow, but then something else has to be simplified so that we can still manage it. And we started with a mountain bike, then added very early on performance gravel bike. And that's really what launched the company into being one of the innovators on the gravel side, and thinking very early on that could rival road bikes in popularity in a few years. And so that's really what we focused on, and we kept it very simple, more or less only frame sets, now and then a complete bike here and there, but really 90% frame sets, which of course is simplicity, sell direct to the dealers almost everywhere, do everything from our one office. And so also dealers in the US, they deal with the office in Switzerland where Andy lives, and everything is geared towards simplifying things. We don't do marketing, we don't do sponsorships, because that just takes time that we don't have. We don't give credit to our dealers, because then you have to go chase them for money, and that takes time you don't have. So every step of the way, we ask ourselves, like, how can we make this simpler to keep the organization small, even if the sales grow a bit.
Right. So very small volumes, niche type of brand. And then at the same time, so you guys were sort of one of the first to sort of jump into the gravel side of things.
I mean, there were gravel bikes in let's say I'm going to ride 3 months through Mongolia kind of, type of bikes, right? But these were really, I think we were the first to really make a performance gravel bike, where really everything is very much like a road racing bike, except then you have, big tires and slightly different geometry to take care of the terrible roads. But they were really about going fast on gravel, not going for, weeks on end.
Mm-hmm. And Open today, what does it look like? It's still, you guys only take so many orders, only so many, like the volumes are very much limited.
It's still Andy and myself, and we do have some employees. It's not like that's all there is, but there are a handful of people at the Swiss office, and still those, I mean, they are crucial people, because when you have so few, every person matters, right? So there's not a ton of redundancy in the organization in that sense, but we have some really absolutely fantastic people, and the simplicity, in the end, if a dealer calls and he orders one frame or 10 frames, that's not really more work, right? So the work is often in a lot of other processes, and so it starts with the model line. Like, every model you adds work, in every level of the organization, right? So it becomes more complicated.
Sure.
Your inventory becomes more complicated.
Totally.
Customers, dealers call with more questions, because now they have a question about one more model. It creates more choice for the consumer that maybe they don't need, but confuses them, et cetera, et cetera. So it starts with just having a very limited model line, only the bikes we really like and want to sell, and then everything flows from there. And still not, often saying the power of no. So saying no immediately to something, rather than spending time on, like, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we could also, and then 3 months later decide, to not do it, and then you spend all this time on it. So that's really what Open is still today. And yeah, so if you don't do marketing, if you don't do sponsorships, then the only way to really attract attention is through the product and through, the customers' word of mouth. So we focus a lot on those two things and not on much else.
And so with regards to, I guess that begs the question, what the heck happened to all the bike brands during COVID? Where did they all just lose their minds? I mean, can you just give us your take on it? Because I know that like it's easy in hindsight to look back and say, what the hell were you guys thinking? But it's a complex situation, and I guess I was just wondering what your take is on it being so experienced in the business.
Yeah, it was definitely, I mean, there've been a lot of crazy times in the bike industry, but this one certainly ranks up there. I mean, I remember because at that time I was also, already a part owner of 3T. And so, the 3T head office is in Bergamo, which was sort of the first place in Europe that was really hit
Sure.
hard
Yeah,
by COVID. It
absolutely.
was really the
It was the
epicenter, right?
epicenter,
So,
yeah, it totally was.
yeah. So, when that happened, we didn't know anything, right? We knew, like, okay, this is going to be bad. Probably we're going to pretty soon have to close the office. We don't know for how long. Is it months? Is it years? Like, how do you prepare for that, right? So when this was coming, we just thought, well, we don't know how long it lasts, but sure, cash is better than inventory, right? So we had a program we called Cash is King, and we just said, we need to find a way to keep selling as long as possible. And so we were allowed to stay open for quite a while, also because we had, some 3D printers who were like, we started to print pieces for
Ventilators.
like some medical pieces and things like that. Like so we're retooling to do that, like to do our, our job as a good citizen. And then on the other side, we still had a bike business that was just shipping product. And then at some point when it became clear that we'd have to close our warehouse as well, we just loaded up everything or almost everything in our warehouse and shipped it to a warehouse in Denmark, which we had there still as a leftover from the previous distributor. So we could keep shipping out of Denmark, and we worked just really hard to convert our inventory into cash and with discounts and whatever it took, because we just didn't know if this would last, months or years and what the impact would be, right? Now, in retrospect, it's easy to see, but at that point, it was really foggy. So, I mean, then of course came the time where things were sort of open, closed, whatever, every country doing different things. But the common denominator in most countries was that being alone is good, being with a whole bunch of people is not good. So cycling became a great sport to practice. And, plus it's outside. So sales obviously went through the roof in the bike industry. We didn't have that much to sell anymore because the Cash is King project had been pretty successful. But I think, it goes for everybody that, all of a sudden, no matter how old or how bad people's inventory was, they could all of a sudden sell it, right? The world might have been switching to disc brakes, but all of a sudden you could also sell your rim brake bikes again. And so I think what it cleared out and did in that first year is it cleared out everybody's completely obsolete inventory. So the bike industry was definitely overstocked, and COVID solved that problem. And everybody seemed to be very happy about that for a couple of months, and then they decided to put those warehouses fuller than they've ever been with new inventory. Because I guess, people thought that this boom would last forever, right? And I think so there's sort of a couple things going on. One, there were specific parts of the market that had crazy demand. The $500 or the $1,000 commuter bike,
the kids'
that,
bikes,
would help somebody not go into the subway, underground. The kids' bike to keep your kids sane while they cannot do any organized sports. So there were some pockets that really had demand, go through the roof. And then there were some that saw, solid demand, but nothing crazy. Like, the $5,000 bike is usually bought by somebody who's already a cyclist. maybe they treat themselves to an extra bike because they're not going on vacation this year because they can't do international travel, or sort of things like that. So you saw smaller bumps on that. But I think pretty soon, because of course also the supply got, hammered by COVID. So pretty soon, there was issues with inventory, and I think that's where, the industry really lost the plot. And it's funny because even at that time, I remember talking to people about this, and everybody saw these problems, but nobody really took the action. Like you'd have, if a customer is looking for a bike and they can't find it, they call 10 shops, right? And
Yeah,
every shop and
this
say,
is
I don't have that bike. And every shop says, hey, I just lost a sale. But of
right.
course, they only lost a tenth of a sale, right? And so then they go, all these customers go, these shops and go, wow, the demand is really insane. I can't believe how many calls I'm getting for product
Yeah,
that I don't have. So
right.
they were all going like, you know what? I'm going to double or triple my orders.
And so you were saying that there was this duplication of demand, which I think,
Yeah. So if you have a customer that calls 10 shops to find this bike, and nobody has that bike, and every shop thinks they lost a sale when they only lost 1/10 of a sale, and that shop thinks that's not going to happen to me next year, so they order double or triple, what they ordered the year before, and because they're not 100% sure that their main supplier, let's say Trek, will deliver all that, they go, well, just to be sure, I'm also going to order that stuff from Scott,
sure,
or some other
totally.
secondary supplier. And of course, I mean, so these issues were just multiplied along the chain, and then people placing absolutely insane orders. I mean, I know of one of the no, like a really large bike company ordering roughly 6, 7 times, the volume that they'd done the year before.
6, 7 times the volume
And
that they did in one year.
yes,
That's
yes,
insane.
I know. They still have some inventory now if you're interested. But
I imagine they do.
so so this is just, just crazy stuff, right? And everybody was doing that, right? So everybody thought that, hey, there's this extra demand and it's all for me, right? Somehow my competitors are not
Right.
interested in
They
it.
just had some kind of tunnel vision of dollar signs.
And yeah, and of course, I mean, yeah, you have companies that were growing all along and they think we'll keep growing, right? So that's maybe reasonable. And then but there's also companies that have been fairly stagnant and think like, oh, now I see demand,
Thank
pile on,
God.
so I'm going to take
Right.
advantage of that and
Sure.
kickstart the company
When's
again.
this ever going to happen again?
Yeah. And so, I mean, while that, and the thing is also for a long time, those products would not be coming in, right? There would just be one piece missing and you can't make a complete bike. So I think for, a long time in, let's say 2021, people were placing these big orders, but they weren't getting a lot.
Yeah, so it was like
And then,
I wanted to zero in on that, like the gap, like there was like there was like a dark moment where like nothing was coming, and I think it was like early 21 or mid 21 where things sort of ran out, and then I think maybe a year later is when things really started coming. But then at that point in late 22 was when the lockdowns were pretty much gone and people were going back to work and they were going back to the gym and they were going back to hang out with each other. So like it was sort of a perfect
yeah,
storm
in
of like,
January 21, there was really no problem. You could order SRAM and you would get it. They normally 30-day delivery, maybe it was 60, so fine. And then in April 21, like, it was like more than a year, to be delivered.
sure.
I remember there was a tire manufacturer that had like a 3-year lead time. And so what that also did is then people went, started to order further in advance, right? Because, but without canceling anything in the shorter term. So, and a lot of that stuff wasn't coming. And then, yeah, sort of in the middle of 2022, you know, things started coming. And then a lot of people would get their 2021 orders, in June, and their 2022 orders in July, and then their early 2023 things in August, So then all of a sudden they had ordered too much, but it also all came in a couple of months. And of course, the situation had changed greatly on many fronts. obviously on the COVID front, but also now you had the war in Ukraine, you had inflation, you
Yeah.
had people had other worries than buying a new bike. So and so I think what we saw in a lot of stores was that the stores don't necessarily have a ton of overstock in everything, but they, for example, have a ton of overstock in these $500 to $1,000 city bikes.
And kids' bikes.
And they have so much stock on that, so much cash tied up in that, so much space tied up in their stores on that they just cannot take on the stuff that maybe still would sell, or at least not in the quantities that would really be beneficial to them. And but then also at the same time at the higher end, demand was still reasonable, but also not record high, because okay, when you have a $5,000-6,000 bike, you don't have to buy it this year. You can also buy it next year. So if you are worried about inflation and maybe your job, or
You're gonna
World
wait.
War III or whatever it is you're worried about, why not wait a year? And so I think it was, that was sort of a perfect storm coming together with all that inventory coming on, and at the same time the demand really, really plummeting. And so so that means, that the warehouses were full before COVID. They were empty for a couple months, and then they filled up quicker than they ever emptied. And now it's throughout that chain, right? I mean, there are so many assemblers, so the companies in Taiwan, China, mostly, that turn all the parts into complete bikes. I mean, there's so much inventory sitting there from brands who just simply cannot take it. They don't have space, they don't have the money. So yeah, all these brands have full warehouses, and they know that at their assembly partners in Asia, they have even more sitting if they ever get their own warehouses empty. So this
Okay,
is
so it's February 6th, 2024. What are you seeing now in terms of like, where are we in the curve of getting out of this thing?
I mean, I know there are brands that have, 3-4 years of inventory. There's just no other way. And you see every brand, dealing with it in a different way, right? I mean, if you go, maybe a good example is maybe if you go to the Specialized website, right, you can now get a Specialized SL6, SL7, and SL8. Like there's 3 model generations that are for sale, right, which is unusual for them.
Sure.
Right, normally they'd sell out of one, and then maybe you have a bit of overlap with second, but they have 3 generations. And so that's one way to do it. Like, of course, they introduced the SL8 while they still had a lot of stock of the other ones. And there are other brands that, I know, that are holding back new model introduction. So then their new model is just sitting in a warehouse. You just think, no, we want to only focus on selling the current models first before we introduce something new. But whichever way you do it, if you have 3 years of inventory, you have 3 years of inventory. So you can, sell it chronologically or all at the same time. But I don't think either way really generates a lot of extra interest as customers or extra sales. So it's still going to take you 3 years. And then, there are also brands who've managed it better and who have almost no excess inventory. And, they're still competing with brands that do, right? So they're competing on price where product may get discounted, or they're competing for this floor space for this dealer that's still pretty stocked up. And even if the dealer is selling it, there's a huge push, of course, from their mainstay brands to take more inventory, because, those brands need to get rid of it some way. So I think in that sense, in general, I think we're still in the midst of it. I have to say, I've seen fewer bankruptcies and things than I would have expected. Of course, we've seen a couple, and a couple high profile ones, but they're both on the dealer level and on the brand level. There must be people, who are really suffering and who will still, not make it beyond this, right? Because you also have to understand on the dealer level, one way or another through COVID, they've also lost months. So yeah, they've had banner sales if they could get the product, but also a lot of dealers have not been able to benefit really from the boom, but they had the bust beforehand where they had to be closed in countries who didn't see a bike shop as an essential service or what have you, right? So, and of course the bike shop was, in most cases not like a super profitable business to begin with. So
it's a tough business.
it can be quite tough if you have 3 or 4 months of revenue missing and you didn't really get the boom after that because you're not in that segment of the market or because you couldn't get the product. So I would fear that we still will see, quite a bit of damage from stores and brands. And of course, the one sort of escape route that stores often had was
Discounting.
maybe not so good for the owner, but at least for it's discounted, but everybody's discounting. And if the demand is
Sure.
not there, then everybody's just making less on each bike. But, they're not increasing the volume. But of course, the other one is selling their shop to their biggest supplier, right? I mean, the Trek company store or
Sure.
specialized
Yeah, there was always
store, or whatever it is.
that opportunity.
And so that was always a way out. But now with not all of those brands, some of those brands are still strong, but some of those buyers are not in the market right now to buy bike shops, right? Because they have their own financial issues. So they might still take them over just because, these shops owe them so much money that, but aside from some specific deals like Mike's Bikes in the US, and it's that route might not be available to people. So then it gets really tricky on how to survive.
Well,
Gerard, time. So
let's try and end it on a positive note, though, if possible. It does feel like, I mean, at least
a positive note, if I may, maybe there's not, but I mean, this too will pass, right? Like it's all these things are bad, but if you look at the overall trajectory of cycling, that's good, right? I mean, participation is up. Of course, it's a clean mode of transportation. It's a great way to avoid obesity, which is a big problem in our world. So there's plenty of positive things about the bike industry if you look at a 10-year horizon. But if you look at a 6-month horizon, then all you see is a lot of boxes.
Sure. Okay.
Maybe you have an even more positive question, so I give an even more positive answer.
Okay, you kicked it back to me. No, I was hoping to jump into your adventure with 3T because somehow you guys had a time machine back in 15 and came up with gravel bikes. I don't know how you guys pulled that off, but you did. So maybe we can jump into the 3T adventure on another, because I want to be respectful of your time, but maybe on another call, on another discussion. But yeah, no, like I said, I think there is a lot of really positive things happening right now. I'm working with a bike shop nearby, and they're seeing lots of good, green shoots. And the macroeconomic trend for cycling is incredibly positive. So from that regard, I think we're actually doing, we're looking pretty positive. But yeah, no,
Absolutely.
So this was a fun conversation, Gerard. Like I said, it was really nice talking with you. And I guess if people want to get in touch with you or want to find you or follow you, I guess, where can they find you?
But if you want to contact me specifically, then Gerard.cc is the way to do that. But
okay, well, thank you, Gerard, and
thank you.
Yeah, hopefully see you very soon.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks, White.